I'm going to give you a little bit of a 30-second introduction because I'm sure most of you who've been focusing on the UK don't know of MEED Projects and don't know of our activity in the Middle East. We are a sister company to Glenigan, based in Dubai. It's an online project tracking database, similar in nature to Glenigan, covering 8 major sectors, so not just buildings and construction, but everything from oil and gas. Anything that is built on solid ground, we cover those projects. We're looking at 18 markets in the Middle East and North Africa, and 2 now in East Africa, Tanzania and Kenya, and some more in East Africa in 2015. Some stats there just to tell you the scope of the coverage, about 19,000 profiles. It's about 15,000 projects. Some projects with master plans and sub-master plans contain multiple profiles. About 12,000 of them are active, 1,500 on hold, although that number is reducing, as we'll see in just a moment. Anyway, that just gives you a flavour of what we do and who we are. Our credentials, we are based in the Middle East, as I've said, in Dubai. We've been in the Middle East under the parent brand of MEED since 1958, post-Suez. So we've been around, and MEED is a well-recognised business information brand in the Middle East. We've been tracking projects, so tracking stuff that's being built since 2002, and actually we've got some stuff that's a little bit older than that. And we've been based in the heart of New Dubai for about 10 years. And this is the view, lovely view from the office window looking north, and you can see the Burj Al Arab on the left-hand side, the iconic sail building. And in the very dim distance, in the middle of the picture, just to the right, you can see the Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest building. That's about 10 kilometres away. We have a 360-degree view, so we can see the Palm immediately to our left and the Sheikh Zayed Road to the right. It's a fantastic place to see what is going on. And I'll give you a flavour of that in the next 20 minutes or so. So some notes on the economic outlook, because I think this provides some useful context to the information I'm going to give about building and construction and projects in the region. The numbers I've got here are from the IMF April WEO. The October WEO has been published, but actually it's little different. And what we'll see in most cases for the GCC, and by the GCC I mean the 6 nations that are at the heart of this region, that's Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, Saudi and the UAE, is that the forecast for this year and for next year little changed if you take the 2 years together. So there's been a little bit of a downward adjustment for most of these economies in terms of GDP growth because of the slump in the oil price. But actually, by and large, we're predicting, or the IMF is predicting, that will be adjusted next year. So what we've seen in these numbers is downward adjustment this year, upward adjustment next year. The interesting thing, and the reason that I've focused in on this box here, is the trajectory of that red line. That's the UAE, that's the United Arab Emirates, of which Dubai is one emirate. And the trajectory of that line has been little change for the last 3 years. So they've been predicting something like upper 4s, 5% per annum GDP growth for about the last 3 years. It hasn't much changed. And that is the reason that this particular market and this particular group of markets is as attractive as it is. It's a very stable place to be. Stable economic growth, stable and secure, somewhat immune, we'd say, to the effects of the Arab uprisings and the Arab Spring in 2011. And we'll come on to a little bit more of that in a moment. I can't pass this by without talking about the oil price, which of course has taken a bit of a battering in the last 6 months. We're now hovering around $80 a barrel from an IMF forecast of $104 a barrel this year. Most of the break-evens for the GCC governments are between now $50 and $90 a barrel. Last year, that break-even oil price was around $70 to $80 a barrel. So what governments have done pretty successfully in all of these markets over the previous 4 or 5 years is not spend any money. They just don't spend money when there's a tightening of the oil price. So we've seen that very much And in fact, Oman, which is probably the one that is most on the cusp, its break-even oil price is around $75 a barrel, has talked about borrowing money. Unheard of for a GCC government, but they are now talking about borrowing money for the first time. Because of what happened in 2011, general civil unrest and so on and so forth, governments realise that they have to spend money on social infrastructure. They have to do it. The other big driver, of course, in terms of the general economy is population growth. And the UAE and KSA, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in particular, are sucking in huge amounts of immigrant population, immigrant labour, and that is in itself boosting the need for housing, social infrastructure, transport infrastructure, utilities, and so on and so on. So we've got compound annual growth in population of around about 3% a year from now until 2017, and that's projected to continue well into the next decade. So population is a huge driver of the economy in these stable core markets of the Middle East and North Africa region. So let's look at the GCC. And again, the GCC in the context of the Middle East and North Africa represents about $3 in every 4 spent on projects in the whole of the 18 markets of the Arab world plus Iran. So you've got the 17 Arab-speaking markets plus Iran. The GCC represents 75% of all of the money spent on projects in the region. And if you narrow it down one stage further, the UAE and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia account for about half of that again. So the real focus of what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes is really about the GCC. So here is the value of contracts awarded in the GCC across all sectors, not just the buildings sector, between 2007, so we go pre- and post-recession. In Alan's presentation, we talked about the recession happening in Europe, in the UK, in 2008. It did not hit in this part of the world until the end of 2009, until, in fact, 2010. By which time most spending was committed for 2010, so the effects of that global recession did not start to really hit hard, and we'll see this in the next slide, until 2011, 2012, and in fact, slumps in spending in some markets was simply picked up by increases in spending in other markets. So what we've got, actually, between 2007 2013, is a reasonably steady, stable pattern of contract award and work being awarded. The bottom chart here shows that a little bit with a slightly different angle. So if you look at the 2009 bar, the 416 contracts that were awarded that were worth more than $50 million, there were fewer of them, but the average spend on those contracts, the average value of those contracts was significantly higher. And the reason for that was with large numbers of major international contractors looking to exit the Middle East in the light of what was happening elsewhere in the world. There was a big panic. But the NOCs, the national oil companies, took that opportunity to really drive a hard bargain when they came to awarding massive capacity building contracts for new refineries, new upstream oil, new upstream gas in 2009. So 2009 was sustained in terms of contract awards by activity in good old hydrocarbons. That's the stuff that this region is built on. So this illustrates the trend over the last over that 8-year period, in a slightly different way. So the UAE, and when you think of construction in the Middle East, everyone thinks of shiny skyscrapers in Dubai, and really until 2008, 2009, that was the case. But you can see, if you look at the fourth bar along there, which is the 2010 bar, there was a big slump in the value of contracts awarded in the UAE construction sector in 2010, slumped even further in 2011, but that was offset in terms of contractors who were based in the Middle East by the value of contracts awarded in Saudi Arabia. So where the UAE was slumping, KSA, the Saudi Arabia, continued to award contracts and spend money. A large amount of that, of course, was in oil and gas until the Arab Spring struck in 2011, at which point governments got a large wake-up call and decided that the best way to appease increasingly angry populations was to spend money on social infrastructure, housing, hospitals, schools, and transport, for the most part. So, looking again at the historical perspective, and this puts the UAE in a bit more focus. This is infrastructure spending. So this isn't the value of contracts awarded. This is the amount of money being spent in particular sectors between 2004 and now. So over a 10-year period, how much money was spent on infrastructure, by which I mean power, utilities, water and transport. Well, the answer is about $300 billion. And that contrasts with $450 billion worth of contracts awarded for those same projects. Keep those figures in your head, because we'll come back and focus on how that looks from a Dubai perspective in a few slides' time. But that's pretty chunky. So we've gone from virtually no spending on infrastructure to colossal spending in infrastructure over a 10-year period between 2004 and 2014 in the GCC. For construction, by which I mean buildings, we're talking about $500 billion worth of contract awards versus about the same amount spent. So what we've got there is there's no lag. Everything that has been awarded largely was built to the end of 2013, and we're now starting to see that pick up again. The end two bars just give you the Dubai and what we call the other Emirates. There are 7 Emirates in the UAE. Dubai is just one of them, but it gives you the relative importance of Dubai as a cornerstone of the buildings market, the buildings projects market in the UAE, and actually, as we'll see in a moment, across the whole of the GCC. So looking ahead, what we have, the top left vertical bar chart is the value of announced, that's projects that we know about that have been announced, obviously, but not yet awarded. And this is buildings projects only. So the UAE accounts for around $500 billion worth of all the buildings projects that we know about that will be awarded between now and 10 years' time-ish. In the GCC. Saudi accounts for slightly less of that, but you can see, as I said at the start of the presentation, the relative importance, the huge the huge importance of the UAE and Saudi in this region. They are really the drivers of everything that happens. Qatar, everyone knows about from talking about the World Cup in recent days, has not yet really lived up to the promise of that award in 2010. It's coming, and we see some green shoots of that this year, but it's taking its time. The next chart on the right, just to give you a flavour of how, as to what projects are actually being tendered. So if on the left we're talking about simply projects that we know about, so projects across all active statuses, whether they are simply at feasibility study or design or under execution. On the right-hand side, what we've got is projects that are actually under tender. So the vast majority of those are, starting at the bottom, streets, utility networks, what you might call local infrastructure, so local roads, local utility networks, and significant spending, significant imminent contract awards, I should say, not spending, on hospitals and healthcare, and a large chunk of that is in Saudi Arabia. Huge increase in healthcare spending, physical healthcare spending in Saudi Arabia since 2011. So looking ahead, some slightly firmer forecasts. We expect the bottom left-hand corner there is this year. So we've already seen awarded buildings projects in the UAE worth about $27 billion, and we're expecting another 11 billion to be awarded in the next few weeks. So if you remember that a couple of slides back, we looked at the relative slump in contract awards for the construction sector in the UAE. That has really now started to motor. It is now on the significant increase. Not quite the same for Saudi, so we saw some strong activity in Saudi in 2011, 2012, 2013. That has now started to drop off, and we suspect that is because of wobbles around the oil price. So we've got around $8 billion worth of contracts awarded in Saudi Arabia, with $17 billion worth of contracts that are scheduled to be awarded this year. They're not going to award $17 billion worth of contracts in 5 or 6 weeks. It ain't going to happen. So Saudi Arabia displaced the UAE and Saudi, sort of swap around periodically, year to year, and the UAE will be the largest projects market in the Middle East in 2014. So just to try and encapsulate all of that, the UAE accounts for about a fifth of all known future projects in the GCC. That's not to say that it will be a fifth, but it's of the projects that we know about, it accounts for about a fifth. The UAE accounts for about a third of all buildings projects. And if we look at buildings projects in Dubai, as an interesting stat here, buildings projects account for over 90% of all known projects in Dubai. So construction, buildings are a really, really important part of what is happening in the region's single largest projects market. Just a note here on mixed use, because mixed use, we'll see this on a slide in a moment when we take a closer look at Dubai. Mixed use covers, as we know, a whole gamut of subsectors: residential, hotels, retail, commercial, and so on and so forth. It is a huge chunk of planned buildings projects in the region, and all of the major developers, the Mirases, the Emaars, and so on, all of them have very, very strong mixed-use pipelines. So let's take a quick and closer look at Dubai, because Dubai, I think, is probably the market that most people are familiar with, most used to reading about. And this just gives you a flavour of what's coming up, and we'll take a slightly closer look at Expo 2020 and some of the plans around that. So those of you who know the region know that Ajman is Dubai's very much poorer country cousin. And this is a little bumper sticker that emerged on the back of a four-wheel drive in Dubai a year ago when Dubai won or was awarded Expo 2020. Ajman is never going to win an Expo ever. So just a little meme there. So Expo 2020, what was it all about? Well, Expo 2020, when it was awarded, was signalled as the thing that was going to boost or drive the Dubai construction sector from now until 2020. In fact, if you look at the numbers, there has been a gradual and steady recovery in the Dubai construction sector since the end of 2011. Expo was probably more a symptom of that recovery rather than a cause and a spur to it. But the really, really important thing, the thing that it has done most for Dubai, it has generated incredibly positive sentiment. It has put Dubai to some extent on the world map. It has made people remember that Dubai exists, and the Dubai government is incredibly proud of its achievements in securing the award of Expo. You cannot underestimate unless you're there and sensed it, you cannot underestimate the spur that it has given to the sense that Dubai is back. And it really is. The amount of traffic on the roads, the amount of dust in the air has increased enormously, really, since that. We've noticed it more since that award at the end of 2013. Dubai, importantly, is a non-oil economy, so it's not immune from, as anywhere, from a slump in the global oil price. but it is less impacted by it. A non-IMF take on GDP growth revised GDP growth for the UAE up to well over 5%, closer to 6%, and that was from one of our customers, Monica Malik from EFG Hermes, one of the Middle East's oldest investment banks. And that really does seem to be the case. The place is growing like crazy, and it is expected to hit double digits from the end of next year. Why is that? Well, her hypothesis is that Dubai, the UAE broadly, but Dubai in particular, is a safe haven for capital in a region that has been sort of ripped apart by civil unrest over the last three and a half years, and civil unrest has now extended, of course, to full-blown civil war in Syria and the ongoing situation with ISIS in northern Iraq. So there has been a massive influx of capital into the UAE from the wider region, which has contributed 2%, not 2%, but 2 percentage points to GDP growth between 2011 and the end of last year, according to Monica. We can't avoid mention of debt. 102% of GDP for a place, this is Dubai, a place that apparently doesn't have a solid base for its economy, is a bit concerning, but the big debt covenants that were due in the middle of this year passed without incident, and we have every reason to believe that the two that are due next year, Dubai World and Nakheel, will again pass without incident. Interesting, the government debt ratios in brackets after the 102 there. So you've got 17% of is the level of government debt for the UAE as a whole, 35% for Qatar and Bahrain. The reason that there is no government debt is that governments in this region, as I said earlier, don't borrow money. Dubai is the only government that borrows money to any great extent. So look at Dubai relative to the rest of the GCC. You can see that after once the global recession hit, Dubai's share of contract awards as part of the GCC as a whole really did plummet. But we are now in 2013 and certainly in 2014 getting back to where Dubai was 5 years ago. So in terms of Dubai's share of 2014, we expect that Dubai will be about 20% of GCC contract awards this year. So the reason for this chart really is just to illustrate the fact that that sentiment, which has been encapsulated by the Expo Award for 2020, is also backed by the numbers. Dubai is back as a relative to its competitor nations, and by competitor nations, I do mean its own domestic Emirates too, including Abu Dhabi. So remember this slide from a couple of minutes ago. We talked about infrastructure spend. The point with this one is that Dubai's spending on infrastructure, on water, utilities and transport, Dubai has awarded something like $53 billion worth of contracts in the infrastructure sectors since 2004 and has spent $52 billion. So it accounts for a fifth of all the GCC's roads, a fifth of all the GCC's spending on airports, and because of the Dubai Metro, over half of all the money spent on rail infrastructure in the region. So the point here is that when the Dubai government, and this is the RTA, the Road Transport Authority, is an executive agency of the Dubai government, when the Dubai government says, you know what's happened there? We've gone down. When the Dubai government says that it's going to award a contract and deliver a project, it awards a contract and delivers a project. It's really that simple. The one thing that I can point to that really encapsulates this is that when the RTA announced that the Dubai Metro project had started in about 2004, it picked a date. It said on the 9th of September 2009, 090909, the Dubai Metro will open. And that was the number that was published everywhere. It was publicised incredibly widely. And duly on the 9th of September 2009, the metro opened. There it was. And it's still there. And if you ride on it, it is a terrific piece of engineering. In terms of buildings, GCC, about $500 billion worth of spending against a similar level of awards. Dubai has spent about $180 billion. It accounts for over 40% of all the GCC's residential spending, nearly a half of all the GCC's mixed-use spending, about a quarter of all the GCC's retail spending, and about a third of all the GCC's hotels. So Dubai, in terms of buildings, really is the driver of project activity in this part of the world. And there you can see Dubai and Abu Dhabi relative to other markets in the GCC. So looking ahead to the future, Dubai accounts for about 10% of all known future projects in the GCC. It's 80% of all known buildings projects, and the civil sectors together, so buildings and transport, accounting for nearly every single project every single contract, I should say, that will be awarded in Dubai between now and 2020. And that's what the civil sector subsector split looks like. I talked earlier about mixed use, of course, covering that multitude of different subsectors. There's a reasonably even split, I'd suggest, between residential, hospitality, retail, leisure and commercial. It's a pretty even split in that mixed use chunk between those five. Quick look at contractors. So between pre and post recession, if I hop back a little here, on the bottom left-hand corner, you can see that the top 20 contractors ranked by value of contracts awarded in that important pre-recessionary period. And then look at it again afterwards. I think there are 9 contractors that featured pre-recession that are still there and still performing quite strongly. The mix of that other 9 has changed considerably. So where pre-recession we saw quite a lot of Japanese and European contractors, they have been replaced to a very large extent by Koreans, lower-cost Asian providers like Shapoorji Pallonji, and increasingly bigger and growing local contractors who have partnered with major European, Australian contractors. So a changing mix. There's a solid base of contractors that have stayed with it and remained loyal, if you like, to the UAE, to Dubai, but at the bottom end, cost has become a factor, and we've seen the emergence of lower cost providers in that mix. So let's have a very, very quick look at Expo before I wrap up. So Expo 2020, it's an investment plan in itself worth about $7 billion. So relative to what Dubai will deliver between now and 2020, Expo itself isn't a vast piece of that. The project is just self-contained on a new site near the new Maktoum International Airport, and the Expo site is that blue slice on the left-hand side. It's an enormous site as a whole. The Maktoum International Airport site is absolutely colossal. That bottom road axis is about 15 kilometres, so it's a very, very big site. The real driver, though, the reason that Expo is so important is that it's driving so much other activity, so much other government spending on infrastructure. So we're talking about 4 metro line extensions, so another up to 15 kilometres of metro, another half dozen stations, hundreds and hundreds of kilometres of new road, I think about 500 kilometres of new road across the Emirates, and 19, and the master plan model itself is 19 road intersections of about 150 that will be built between now and 2020. So Expo is important in itself. It's a big project, but it's much more important as a spur to other investment and infrastructure activity that will be funded by and paid for by the Dubai government. Some little bit more detail on what that means. The Al Sufu tram, which is an interesting one, a new tramway project that actually opened 2 weeks ago in Dubai. It's some people call it a showcase or a tourist destination. But it's actually a working tram that takes quite a lot of cars off the road between the marina, an important residential area, and Dubai Internet City and Dubai Media City, two quite big hubs of commercial office type activity a kilometre or two away. So it's an important stake in the ground as far as the Dubai government is concerned about its intentions with regard to supporting public transport. And that goes hand in hand with this 750 kilometres of cycleways. People think, bloody hell, you can't cycle in Dubai, it's too hot. But you can for 3 months of the year, it's absolutely fine. Actually, more like 7 months of the year, it's fine. But you do see people cycling, and the reason that people don't cycle is because it's so bloody dangerous. But with the cycleways, that problem goes away. A very important stat here is the number of projects, or the value of projects that have started to resume. So huge numbers of projects were put on hold in 2009, mothballed, and they are now being recovered to a fairly chunky extent. $13 billion worth of projects resumed, and if you factor in that some of those projects are part of bigger master plans, it's more like possibly $50 billion worth of projects resumed. This is the UAE, and mostly, as you can see from the red bar there, mostly Dubai. So a huge amount of stuff coming back to life that was previously not happening. So lastly, and I won't go too much into the detail of this, but if you stack up the information from the MEED Projects database and look at it, we are confident that the UAE is currently the UAE construction sector is a very, very good sector to be supplying and contracting into. It is, what we've got here, very, very briefly, is the red line shows the number of projects that were announced in 2012 that have not progressed beyond early feasibility stage. So that ratio is very low. So if a project was announced in 2012, the chances are it's going to happen. It's progressing to award, execution, and completion. So how do we know all this? There's a nice picture of Alexander running around Dubai in a car, taking photographs of construction sites. That's largely how we do it in the UAE. We zone the UAE, drive around and take photographs. We surveyed every single construction site in the UAE. We've now done the same in Qatar, Oman, and we're currently in Kuwait at the moment. What it's added is an enormous number of smaller projects that we didn't know about, and actually some parts of larger projects that we didn't know about. And that's added about $75 billion worth of project opportunity to the database. And all of that stuff that we're collecting tips into the database, and it gives us maps. Maps are not an easy thing to come by even in Dubai. And it gives us photographs, so customers can look at the photographs and judge for themselves whether a project is recovered or not. Opportunities, very quickly, this is my final slide. Architectural design, you've only got to look at photographs or read an article in the newspaper to see that Dubai really has become the architect's playground, very high quality, mid-tier stuff that is emerging, looks amazing. I would still say, though, that price is a major driver of whether you're going to win a contract. So you've got to have something that looks iconic, and everyone talks about iconic design, but cost is still a major factor. Specialist material supply, there is a growing desire for innovative materials, particularly around things like energy saving. The green buildings movement is fairly nascent in the Middle East, but it is starting to make a difference. Power generation too, so clean tech is becoming important. Quite a big contract award from DEWA, the Dubai Electricity and Water Authority, under the auspices of Sheikh Mohammed, was awarded about 3 months ago, a pretty tens of millions dollar contract to develop a solar park in the desert. Rail is a major sector, so every single GCC country now, including Dubai already has the metro, but there is a Etihad, a nationwide rail service that will be built in the next 10 years. Saudi has similar schemes, as does Kuwait. Qatar certainly does, with Q-Rail in the infrastructure that's being developed for the World Cup. And there are major logistics hubs. You've got 3 in Dubai and 1 in Abu Dhabi, and all of them are in a stretch of coast that is about 60 kilometres long. So between the current Dubai airport through Maktoum International up to Abu Dhabi, sorry, it's a bit more than 60, about 100 kilometres, 60 miles. You've got 4 major logistics centres. With growing populations, of course, water becomes increasingly important. Water reuse, water recycling, and desalination becomes incredibly important. And Abu Dhabi is now already talking about revamping or rebuilding an RO plant that it built not 10 years ago. And growing populations mean waste. The Middle East hasn't yet really worked out how to deal with all its waste. So if people have waste management expertise, the Middle East is a growing market opportunity. And there finally are the logos of some of the companies that benefit from our services in this part of the world. And that's me. Thank you very much.